welcome. We're really pleased to have you all join us for the kickoff of our fall speaker series for the NYU Urban Lab. We have 3 panels that we are doing on a Green New Deal for the FDR. I'm going to take just a couple moments and tell you a little bit about NYU and what this panel is about. So for NYU, the Urban Lab is part of the Schack Institute of Real Estate. We are a part of a series of different research centers at the NYU Schack Center, and I am the director of the Urban Lab and also a clinical assistant professor at NYU Schack. We have a couple different efforts at the Urban Lab that are all focused on equitable and inclusive growth. That's the idea that we can see an increase in the economy and in real estate without gentrification, and that we could use redistribution to try to be sure that as cities and communities come up, all members of those communities, even those that have been historically disenfranchised, get an opportunity to be a part of that. And every human in that area has a chance to live a life of dignity. So that is related to issues of environmental justice, food security, infrastructure, affordable housing, and the future of our cities, what they will look like. Our particular efforts right now include not only this Green New Deal for the FDR, but also we're doing work on an inclusive growth scorecard, especially in the light of the almost $1 trillion that now has been raised for ESG. We're very interested in making sure that there actually are frameworks to measure whether or not investors are achieving that ESG goals, and that there is some third party that has some ideas, especially on what the S and the G might look like as those emerge. We also are in the midst of doing an HBCU, Historic Black Colleges and Universities report that is paralleling the loss to personal wealth and families from redlining to the institutional loss in communities from those HBCUs really getting disproportionate treatment. We are looking at the adaptive reuse of malls and the take back of the suburbs as places that can actually be equitable and affordable. We're examining the possibility in gentrifying areas such as Reno of inclusive and impact developers being able to hit their returns and actually deliver meaningful equitable development, and also are out in the metaverse creating some classes for interactivity. We have a research campus in Nevada that stretches from very rural and ephemeral refugee type areas through a tribal area, a rural area, and an urban area, Reno. We're partnered there with the county, the city, and some unique organizations such as Burning Man to try to imagine what human settlements look like when we're able to create inclusive growth outcomes. So that is the background on the Urban Lab. Please do feel free to contact me if you have any questions about that. I will drop my email in the chat here. But today, we're not going to talk about all that. We're zooming in on inclusive growth and infrastructure around the FDR. In specific, I'm very pleased to be joined by these panelists, whom I will be introducing in one moment, Jerrod, Jessica, Adam, and Michael. They each bring truly unique and deep experience in their areas to educate us about both the FDR, the ideas of inclusive growth. And in this particular time, we're going to be focusing in on the Harlem River Greenway link. The FDR is quite a large project as its whole, and we're using these panels to introduce different portions of it. In general, FDR is about 10 miles long. It goes across dense neighborhoods. It goes across NYCHA developments. It goes across very high-end developments. And there are lots of different resilience efforts and planning going on. There's recreation planning. Adam's going to talk a lot about the overall plan and how the city has viewed that. And starting 2 years ago, we thought it would be great to convene a bunch of stakeholders on something that is this large to make sure that information is flowing and there is a third party such as NYU with really zero interest in the game other than trying to raise awareness about what might be possible, serve as a convener. As part of this work, we have sent out letters to every tenant association, every resident, and every owner along the FDR. We continue to try to build that organizing list. And in 2021, we worked with the Waterfront Alliance, NYU, and the Urban Land Institute to convene an initial technical assistance panel. We found that the topic was so big, it was really hard to make progress in just a couple of days. So we've now spanned out to doing several months of these types of panels, and we're looking to revisit a more cohesive panel in the spring. There have been various different planning areas that we focus on. Unfortunately, this document doesn't go all the way up to where we actually will be looking. One of the big issues, of course, is flood resilience. And as we start thinking about coastal protection, we don't want to think about it in the abstract from access to recreation, environmental justice, transportation rebuilding, affordable housing, really trying to propose an integrated approach. There have been many more plans than we can possibly describe, and much more community outreach that has gone on here at a very deep level. I'm just showing a snapshot of one of the East River Park charrettes and then reports that came out. These things are so deep. We are compiling a list of many of them, and we'll be publishing them on our website before the end of the year so that people just have a little wiki or something that they could go through and learn about the pieces that are interest to them. And from our perspective, the reason NYU is engaged in this is that we're interested in providing assistance to identify best practices for advancing equitable, complex transportation and resilience infrastructure projects. What is the structure that will work, that has worked in the past, that hasn't worked in the past for similar sized projects? What's the process for getting there? How does financing happen? And what are the actual metrics to decide if something has been successful? So with that is the most that I will talk the whole time. I am super excited to be able to now introduce the panelists, or have the panelists each introduce themselves. I've asked them each just to talk for 3 to 5 minutes about who they are and how they got here. Then following that, Michael is going to give us a little bit of a deep dive into the Harlem River Greenway link. And then I have 4 or 5 questions I'm going to toss at them. You all should also feel free to prepare your questions. You can drop those in the chat, and Daniela will keep a list of those, and we'll turn around to those when we get back to the end. So thank you all for joining us. And with that, I am going to turn it over to the first introduction, which will be Adam.
Great. Well, it's great to be with you all today. Thank you, Professor Kay, for that introduction. Matt and I actually go way back. We worked together at EDC for many years when Matt was running our asset management division. So really feels good to be back together with you talking about important stuff. So to introduce myself, I'm Adam Grossman-Marr. I'm an urban planner in New York City government. I've been in city government for really my entire career, about 15 years. I'm currently Senior Vice President and Head of Neighborhood Strategies for EDC. Before that, I was at the Department of City Planning in the Manhattan Borough Office for about 4.5 years. So EDC I will not attempt to explain everything that we do, but we are the city's primary economic development agency. We manage city-owned assets and property on behalf of the city. We build capital projects. We do public-private real estate development. We work to grow important strategic industries for New York City's economy, like life sciences. And in my part of the organization, we do neighborhood planning. So that takes a lot of different forms and a lot of different topics, from neighborhood infrastructure to community-driven planning, to climate resilience, to zoning and land use, all over the city, from downtown Far Rockaway to Hunts Point in the South Bronx to Lower Manhattan and the North Shore of Staten Island and many other places. I'm really excited for this conversation. I will pause there and look forward. Really glad to be on this panel with my fellow great panelists.
Great. Thank you, Adam. Also great to be back with you talking about big New York City things. So appreciate you taking the time. Next, we have Jessica.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today and for organizing these important conversations. My name is Jessica Elliott. I'm a first-generation college graduate and a licensed architect. I'm an associate at Hart-Howerton, which is an interdisciplinary design firm that encompasses master planning, architecture, landscape architecture, and interior design. I'm the vice chair of Manhattan Community Board 11, which is the neighborhood of East Harlem. And I also sit on the Land Use, Landmarks, and Planning Committee, as well as the Executive Committee, and serve as the chair of the Environment, Open Space, and Parks Committee. I'm personally very passionate about health equity in the built environment, especially as it relates to our work in the community board. And I've been involved as a culture of health leader through the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the ULI Health Leaders Network. I'm also currently serving as a Well City advisor. I'm also the co-chair of ULI New York Urban Plans Steering Committee and the ULI New York Management Committee. And I like to think that all of my hats are as interrelated as the complex issues that we're all trying to address together. Thank you so much for having me.
Wow, Jessica, a lot of participation. I'm going to have to steal that line. All of my hats are a reflection of the interaction of complex projects we work on. That's really wonderful. Next, we have one of my Schack colleagues who also is a successful affordable housing developer, Jerrod.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Matt. My name is Jerrod Delaine. I'm a professor at NYU. I'm also an alum of NYU, and really glad to be here and be a part of this conversation. So a little bit about me. I got my undergraduate degree in architecture from Florida A&M School of Architecture, and got my first job in architecture in Central Florida. And just so happened my team worked with a lot of affordable housing developers. And I got to see how they were doing all these, what they were calling 4% and 9% transactions. So I got to kind of see in rapid fire how it worked. It piqued my interest. So I came to NYU to be, to learn how they did this thing. And I've been a developer ever since. So it's been really exciting. And I spent the vast majority of my career in the development space doing affordable and workforce housing. Earlier this year, we kicked off a new company called Legacy, which is focused on raising capital and investing in urban communities around the country. So really excited about it. This infrastructure is a very important piece of communities and having healthy communities. It's a part of the past of how certain communities got broken up and segregated and separated. So I'm really looking forward to how we're gonna, repair our cities and repair our communities. So thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you, Jerrod. It's a pleasure to have you. Thank you for joining us as well. And then finally, we have Michael, who will introduce himself. And then I've also asked him to segue from that into a little bit of an overview of the Harlem River Greenway link. So Michael, the show is yours. Take it away.
Okay, thank you. It's good to see everybody today. I'm Michael Haggerty. I'm a principal of urban design at Starr Whitehouse Landscape Architects and Urban Planners. We're a design firm in Lower Manhattan, and we work on a range of projects related to the public realm in the city and in upstate and also in Atlanta, Georgia. We design parks and public open spaces. We are involved in housing development, both market rate and affordable, designing outdoor spaces and connecting housing development to the urban realm. We design streetscapes, and we're also very much involved in the climate resilience planning that's happening around the city. As a designer, working on public projects, our role is to be there to support our clients, the public agencies, in design and construction of public projects. And this means a lot of different things. We're often in the role of facilitating engagement with community members and community boards and helping to steer public input on design. We also have a role in coordinating with different state and city agencies. We do a lot of work on the waterfront, and there's a lot of infrastructure on the waterfront. And as you can imagine, the owners of those infrastructures need access to them to maintain and inspect them. So when we design a project, a lot of the work is coordinating around infrastructure, but then also on the waterfront, we have to meet many different agency regulations and requirements related to water, related to trees, to lighting, and other factors. So as the designer, we're creating new space, but that is also coming out of a process of coordinating lots of different interests. So with that, I'm going to share my screen here. Can you all see that? Okay.
Yeah, looking good.
Okay, thanks. So I think we're having a broader conversation today about the future of the FDR and kind of looking more locally at a project our firm has been working on with New York City Parks and the Economic Development Corporation for the last 6 years or so. This is the Harlem Greenway. I'm sorry, the Manhattan Greenway Harlem River, which is a new park from 125th Street to 132nd Street on the Harlem River in Upper Manhattan. And actually, I should say, I think the roadway here is Harlem River Drive, that FDR ends just south of 125th Street. This was an important project as it relates to the Manhattan Waterfront Greenway, which is a pedestrian and bicycle path that encircles the island. This segment was the last remaining publicly owned segment of the Greenway that hadn't been built out. There's a few other areas that I think Adam is going to talk about a little bit later, but this was considered one of those missing links in the system. And as a missing link and the last area to be developed, it is also one of the most complicated, but will also unlock a lot of value in terms of connectivity. Whenever we do a project in the city, our firm always looks back to the ecological and hydrological history of the city. So for all of you, if you're not familiar with the Ville water map, this is a really important map to know about. It was created in the 1860s by the city engineers, and it overlays the city's grid with the historic waterways and coastline of the city. And you can learn a lot about the city by looking at this. East Harlem, which is kind of what I'm circling here in Harlem, historically were creeks and tidal lowlands with a marshy river edge. And these are, as a result, these are areas that are vulnerable to storm surge and to cloudburst flooding today, even though all of those marshlands and creeks have been developed. We worked with the city in 2017 to create a resilience plan for East Harlem and Harlem that really asked the question, what is the role of all public spaces in making a neighborhood resilient to climate change and reducing risk? So the waterfront, parks, streets, plazas, spaces around libraries and schools, how can these be adapted to address cloudburst flooding, but also to create coastal flood protection in the long term? At the same time, we had been working on the Manhattan Greenway, and one of the things that we looked at was, where is there pedestrian access to the water's edge in Manhattan? So we made this map that looked at basically like where can you walk at grade on the street to get to the river. And as you can see on the west side and in lower Manhattan, where over the last 30 years, a lot of work has been done to create continuous pedestrian access to the river and the harbor. Whereas on the east side, street level access to the river is very limited. And in East Harlem and at our project site, we'll be providing a new pedestrian level point of access to the Harlem River. And it will be the only pedestrian access for about 4 miles if you go north and 2 miles if you go to the south. So this is a community that, historically has been cut off from the river and natural resources. When we looked back at old Sanborn insurance maps of the area, this is looking at Thomas Jefferson Park, which is about 10 blocks south of our site. One thing we saw when we looked back at the maps from the 20s is that Thomas Jefferson Park used to have a waterfront esplanade and a direct open space connection to the river. But then in the urban renewal era and in the 50s, Harlem River Drive and the FDR were built along the river and effectively cut off the neighborhood from water resources. So this is a significant project, just in the sense of creating that kind of pedestrian access to the river, in addition to creating 7 new acres of open space in the neighborhood. This is an overall view of the project. Here's that connection from 127th Street under Harlem River Drive to the riverfront. The park will have a lawn in the south, a recreation area, a continuous waterfront esplanade, a public artwork, playground, and a barbecue area. In addition to that pedestrian connectivity, this missing link will unlock bicycle network connections for both East Harlem and for the South Bronx. So there'll be new bicycle ramps connecting into the park and the Greenway from the RFK Bridge and from the Willis Avenue Bridge. And the 3rd Avenue Bridge connects into Harlem River Park on the other side of the Harlem River Drive. So these connections are also a real part of the spatial equity story of this project, in terms of connecting people in the South Bronx to bicycle mobility, to job opportunities in Manhattan, connecting East Harlem residents to recreational assets and health assets along the river. So here's an image of the esplanade along the river. You can see on the right one of these ramps that's going to connect from the RFK Bridge. Here's a view of the bikeway. We've designed it such that sometimes it's along the river and sometimes it pulls back into the park into an immersive natural setting. And then importantly, one of the priorities was just to provide passive open space, a space for respite, a space to connect with the river, and have a moment for social gathering in the park. So as I was mentioning in the introduction, a project like this requires quite a bit of coordination with infrastructure. This diagram is showing our park space between the river and Harlem River Drive. Most of Upper Manhattan's waterfront is actually constructed on a waterfront platform. And that's something that comes from when the waterfront was more industrialized. This project is part of a larger infrastructure project of reconstructing that waterfront platform. So as we do that, we're taking into consideration future climate resilience, but then also we have some tricky coordination to do. There's one area where this bulkhead passes over an MTA tunnel that goes under the river. And so we had to think about the constructability and create a special system for bridging that condition. So then going back to the beginnings of this project back in 2016, it really started out of a community engagement process where we worked with interborough partners in the Parks Department to engage nonprofit organizations and residents around programming and circulation and just the vision for this park. We also did what we called mobile engagement, basically setting up on the street and catching passersby to talk about the park. And it's pretty incredible when you do this, how you really just meet a diversity of people of ages and abilities and where they live in the city. And it's a real opportunity to gather a broad spectrum of perspectives on the park. So this is some more engagement we did at an event that happens every year, Party on Park. And the design team's role is to really synthesize these interests into a design that has features that people are interested in, but is also flexible to accommodate a whole range of users. Okay, so that is what I brought to share with you all today about the Greenway. So I guess I'm going to hand it back to Matthew now. Thank you.
Thank you. That was super helpful. And just as a reminder, we're trying to span 2 different topics with this panel. The first one is a deep dive into one of the pieces that's underway. And the other one is stretching out to try to make the connection to overall thoughts about inclusive growth. So with that, I'm going to ask my colleague Jerrod to tell us a little bit about what inclusive growth might look like in general, and what are some of the concerns that you think, Jerrod, should be thought about, at least in the Harlem River Greenway link, and some of the stuff we saw here from Michael.
All right, thank you. Firstly, that's an excellent presentation Michael just gave. That's fantastic. So I lived in Harlem for a number of years. I have many fun memories in the neighborhood. So just looking into the future about how awesome it would be when that's created. But inclusive growth specifically, looks toward economic growth that's distributed fairly, and creating opportunities for all, right? Not just a particular group. So one of the initial thoughts I would think about, this fantastic project is, this is going to be years of construction. How can we figure out to make Harlemites participate economically in this construction project, right? How do we, have local contractors who are based in Harlem? How do we have young people, learn how to do landscape design and landscape construction, right? And have some workforce training programs that will encourage them to not only work on this project, but on future projects. The entire waterway is going to have construction going on for a number of years. How can we get, a diversity of participants? I think cities have started to get smart about that. Many of them mandated, like in Boston. If you take money from the city of Boston, 50% of the contractors have to be from the city of Boston. So how can we think about how to kind of zero in to make sure that economic activity engages those in that local community? I think a great successful example of that is Atlanta, Georgia. Many years ago, the elected officials, mandated that MBE contractors had to participate. The airport got built, the roads got built, but B, there's been a massive economic shift in Atlanta, Georgia, with diverse members of that community. So I think, being inclusive in growth is not only creating this wonderful park in addition to the community, but how to make folks in the community, give them the ability to participate in it. So I think that would be what comes to mind when I think of inclusive growth.
Thank you. Some really good points there. And also, I know we've seen different promises and access points in some of the larger projects across the 5 boroughs, some barriers to participation, especially in local hiring, having to do with PLA, project labor agreements, and unions, and whether or not projects have to be union. I also know that the city does a lot of work trying to understand vulnerabilities in every neighborhood and the unique character of each neighborhood. And I'm going to ask Adam, if you're willing, to kind of zoom out a little bit and talk about how the city, or specifically EDC, evaluates infrastructure projects and thinks about social impacts. I know that during COVID, you came up with some pretty interesting tools that might be worth mentioning. And maybe you can just talk at a larger scale how this fits into how the EDC and your neighborhood strategies group thinks about these things.
Sure, and that's a great question. In some ways, it's the central question, I think, of neighborhood planning today. So so I would say a couple of things. I mean, I think for us, and certainly in the 10 years I've been at EDC, we're always trying to learn and think about how we can do a better job and be innovative in terms of how we not just talk to communities about projects, but how we bring communities in to really define what those projects are. And I think, frankly, the last 2 years, the experience of the incredibly inequitable impacts of the pandemic, as well as the racial reckoning experience of 2020, I think was a real jolt and wake-up call, not just for EDC, but I think for city government and institutions in general. And it's a moment that really forced us to ask, how are we doing that? What kinds of questions are we asking at the beginning of a project, or even before we choose projects? How are we defining equity? And how are we ensuring that we have the tools and the right kind of internal process to force ourselves as an institution to reckon with that. So that's, and I will say, I think not just at EDC, but a lot of New York City agencies have had their own kind of internal movements trying to do that. At the Department of City Planning, my former employer, they created a tool called the Displacement Risk Index, which is now online, and a program in this administration called the SEED Neighborhood Investment Fund. Other agencies I know are doing sort of internal kind of looking at the racial and other sort of equity implications of where they are spending their money. At EDC, we created something called the Neighborhood Vulnerability Dashboard. And this is basically a kind of easy to use tool that takes publicly available data basically around the kind of idea that where you are born, where you grow up, where you live in New York City, your neighborhood greatly shapes your access to economic opportunity and your ability to have a good life for you and your family. And then that goes to the existence of basic infrastructure and services that are fundamental to that. And how do we understand not just what parts of the city are facing poverty, for example, but going a layer or two beneath that and thinking about things like access to open space and a walkable neighborhood, access to fresh food, primary care, financial services, thinking about things like quality of education and availability of workforce training in the neighborhood, and looking at all of those things, which we call domains and indicators, against things like climate vulnerability, historic redlining, rates of incarceration. It is both a data tool that helps us understand those nuances across neighborhoods and where needs are most acute and what kind, but it also forces us to ask questions. That, of course, is only one part of the equation. I think the other, in some ways, most important part is actually talking to communities. And again, doing that not just when you have an idea or you have a project. That's important too, in terms of the work Michael talked about and kind of engaging people in design, but also just in treating neighborhood residents and organizations as the real experts in their communities that we need to learn from. So I think that is kind of the big picture posture about how we do that. I think more specifically in the context of our Harlem River Greenway and the FDR Drive, which obviously the FDR, is part of a whole historical, and I think very intentional decision to marginalize certain communities over others in New York City, that we're still dealing with the legacy of that today. I think in the Manhattan Waterfront Greenway project, which is something my team has led with the Parks Department and DOT, really looking at how we close the remaining gaps in the Manhattan Greenway. So going beyond the really important work that Michael and EDC and CB11 are doing now on the Greenway Link project to really finish the Greenway, and in particular, two sections, one in Inwood and one in Harlem between 145th and 163rd Street, that are obviously in communities of color that historically have not really had the kinds of waterfront open space investments that other parts of the city have enjoyed. So really prioritizing those gaps. And then I'll say lastly, as we think about waterfront edge and greenways across the city, one thing we're doing in this administration with that same group of the same three agencies is really looking to the outer boroughs to do kind of an outer borough greenway plan. We were able to get a federal raise grant to do that. And I think one of the things we're going to be doing is really looking through an equity lens of what parts of the city, again, have not had that kind of investment, and how do we think about that and really foreground that in the decisions of what capital projects to prioritize in the years ahead.
Very exciting stuff. Really so fortunate just to have a bunch of city leaders and city public servants that are focused through that equity lens. I think the whole economy really is moving in that way, but New York continues to be a leader, and I'm really proud to be a part of that. I'd like to turn now and kind of bring back some of these questions to the actual Harlem River Greenway link and what the process was like in the community. And for that, I'd like to turn back to you, Jessica, and just ask, we've spoken about all these ways that a community can be involved, should be involved. How was it with, at least so far, were the communities in the area involved in any of the design or planning process of the project as we've seen it so far? And how would you rate that with other things you've seen, being a community board member and all the other hats that you wear as well?
Yeah, well, before I jump into that question, I just wanted to say, Adam, I loved what you said about utilizing the expertise of the community and the importance of the equity lens. I think a lot of the challenges that we experience in the community board is that we're looking for equitable investment. And for communities like East Harlem, that might need more investment than other neighborhoods who have historically had more investment. As I joined the community board, one of the first things I learned was how important it is to be aware of what came before you and what you don't know. And in that light, I wanted to share my screen quickly to show you an image. This is a former board member and longtime East Harlem community member, Richard Toussaint, and he unfortunately has passed away. And I think that's, we see these projects take, many decades, and the amount of lives that touch these sort of projects in ways are difficult to understand and can create a sense of, distrust in the process when it comes to the public. But Richard Toussaint was the former chair of the Environment, Open Space and Parks Committee. But this was an idea that he had to connect. He drew the first sketch to sort of connect the East Harlem community to the East River waterfront. And then he took it around to the Department of Parks and Recreation, to all of the elected officials, and really helped to garner support for this idea. And our goal in the end is to hopefully name the park after Richard Toussaint, which has been a goal of ours for a long time. And I'm not sure how to stop sharing my screen. There we are. Okay, great. Back to your question. So thankfully, the Harlem Greenway Link project has had deep community involvement from the beginning. And I thought it was funny, Michael, the other day you mentioned we were on a Environment, Open Space and Parks Committee meeting, and one of our new board members had asked about what type of community engagement had been done to this point. And I think it speaks to the amount of, with the length of time that these projects take. We also have turnover in the community boards with our board membership. We have turnover in the city agencies and with our elected officials, and it becomes a little bit difficult to keep track of the sort of institutional knowledge of what's happened. And the community board plays an important, but unfortunately only an advisory role in decision-making around these types of projects, while also trying to integrate the needs, concerns, and desires of the wider East Harlem neighborhood fabric. So the project team with Starr, Whitehouse, EDC, and Parks started with community outreach that helped to define the initial designs. And thankfully, they continue to involve and respond to community needs and concerns. So things like outdoor fitness equipment was really important to us over the pandemic. You would see people using street signs and other items on the street because fitness is important in our neighborhood, and there's just not a lot of space or the ability to do that. Also, what was really important to us was the gathering spaces that Michael walked us through, specifically the areas for barbecues. It can get pretty pretty heated with not a lot of park space and a lot of groups and families and community-based organizations that want to use those spaces. And there's also a placeholder for a future comfort station, which unfortunately isn't funded, but is part of the project, and the utility lines out to that future structure is one of the biggest components. But all of those will be able to be included or expanded based on the conversations that Michael and the EDC team and our community board have had over the last couple of years, and even before I was even on the board. But I think with these large, complex projects, it requires that we work together across partners and stakeholders, and that the relationships with the community boards and community members are taken seriously. But we look forward to using this experience at the Harlem Greenway Link or the future Richard Toussaint Park as an example of community engagement for all of our future projects.
Thank you for that. I have one follow-up for you, Jessica. You'll have to forgive me. I have some students in the audience who are just learning about ULURP and discretionary approvals. And I heard you say that you only had an advisory role as the community board. I'm curious, from your perspective, was there ever actually a discretionary vote for the community board? And if not, I'm going to toss it all the way back to Adam and ask him, what was the process for allocating city capital expenditures in the area? Was there any discretionary action that happened where there was an actual vote of the community to approve the project moving forward? So starting with you, Jessica, was there any votes, or it was all recommendation only?
Yep, it was, we voted as a community board. It starts off in the Parks Committee. We take a vote as a committee, and then that moves to the full board. And then the full board takes a final vote, and that serves as our advisory opinion about this project. And luckily, we've taken many votes on this project, and they've all been in support.
So no controversy from the community's perspective, at least no one that showed up to raise controversy during those votes.
Oh, definitely a lot of controversy. I'm sure if you've ever been to a community board meeting, I don't think you can go without a little bit of controversy, but I think one of the biggest items, and that we continue to talk about, we're working, across elected officials and city agencies to discuss how we're going to get that comfort station funded, because Michael, I'm sure, has PTSD from all of our parks meetings. We spent hours talking about the comfort station and the fact that there are no bathrooms on the waterfront, and that there are small children, there are seniors, there are community organizations that are actively using these spaces, and there's just no way for them to go to the bathroom. And that's a basic, human need.
Yeah. What were some of the other controversies raised, even if they weren't held by more than one or two people? Just, we're building a waterfront esplanade and park. It seems like it should be a pretty communal issue, but of course, with any issue, there are some people who raise valid concerns, and then also just concerns that are reflective of maybe things not having to do with this particular issue, but it's tickled them. So can you give us a sample of one or two others that maybe you heard come up?
Yeah, I think, a lot of it was able to be solved, thankfully, with the conversation and the design process. But, one of the things I've personally struggled with, and I know a lot of my fellow community board members have struggled with, is the width of the park in our section of the community compared to the other sections around, all of Manhattan. Our park is literally right up against the FDR. So I was just on a ribbon cutting event for a public art installation at 100th Street with the Friends of the East River Esplanade, and you can barely hear yourself talking to, the people around you, because the car noise is so loud, and it's visually, it's so apparent, and, it seems a little dangerous at times. So, one of the first questions we asked was, what's the buffering of the landscape between the, the road and the park experience? And, I think there was also, some challenges with the separate pedestrian path from, a separate bike path. So in places that gets combined, and, I'm sure you've been out on the East River Esplanade and you know how many people are out there, but having a single path with bikes and pedestrians it can get congested. And I think, going back to the equity issue, were there ways to spend, a little bit more money to expand the parks where, it would make it a similar experience to other neighborhoods in Manhattan? I think that should have been done, but, we're grateful that this is one of our 2017 rezoning points of agreement. So after so much time, we're glad to see it moving forward.
Thank you for that. I also want to zoom out. I'll reveal my own personal Professor K opinions for a second and throw it out there. And primarily, I'll start with Jerrod and Adam, but of course, all four of you, please definitely feel free to weigh in. I guess in my academic lens, having no understanding of the complexities of the city, just wonder, is there a way that we could have done this to potentially move the highway, remove the highway? What are the issues of environmental justice when we start thinking about locating parks and homes next to congested highways? Of course, it's not just the noise, right? It's the air quality, it's the traffic, it's the cutting off from the waterfront that Michael mentioned. I know it's a big project to think about removing or Of course, there's been ideas of tunnel, et cetera, without getting into the technical details, because frankly, we're New York City. We built Battery Park City. Most of the city has been expanded beyond anything anyone would ever believe was possible. But let's talk now about the actual planning outcomes, EJ outcomes, and how we take into account issues of environmental justice when we're thinking about a congested highway, and why we wouldn't try to maybe move that. I recognize that's a lot of different questions. Everyone doesn't need to tackle them all, but I'd love to go around the panelist room and just hear some of your thoughts on why we even retain that highway at this point. And if we do, how we deal with those EJ issues. What are some of the ways we can tackle those social equity issues? Who wants to start?
I can go first.
Okay, Jerrod, you're up.
So to me, environmental justice is, fair treatment, and meaningful involvement of everybody involved, regardless of race, age, and income. And obviously, in years past, that was not the case when cities were laid out, when cities were planned, when highways were designed, bridges and tunnels. So, there's many famous examples of, a highway cutting through a neighborhood, right, of a factory being built in a residential neighborhood, and kind of the long-term effects. And obviously, we now have research to show, the air quality effects on individuals in the South Bronx. The bus terminal example in Harlem and the effects on young children, everywhere, right? Lead and asbestos examples. That's all well documented. I think now that we know that information, now that we have that data, we could and should design cities better to respond to that we can make every community, where young people, have the opportunity to live their best life and have a good quality of life. So taking away the highway, I think we're probably past that. But, we all know, right, Robert Moses purposely didn't build as many parks uptown, right? That was a very thoughtful thing he did. We can now respond to say, no, we can create more green space in communities that didn't have them. And we now, know the long-term effects. Just the other day, I was at a Chelsea Piers, beautiful outdoor space, and a good quality of life for the community. I think those uptown, they deserve great public space as well. So I think there is the opportunity now, as Michael is presenting, there's opportunity now that we can create that in other communities. I think another great example is Domino Sugar Park, excellent public space that used to be industrial, that is now a great utility to individuals that live in that community in the adjacent area. I think the same thing can happen in this area, that improvement of that waterfront can be not only great for those in the immediate area, but those in the greater area, that it can become kind of a meeting place. It can become a utility for that area. So that's my thoughts on it.
Excellent. Other panelists, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with everything Jerrod is saying. And, I think when you're on the FDR, you ask the question, like, why can't this be like the West Side Highway? Why can't we have this beautiful park system and these connections? And it is a kind of citywide equity issue that it sounds like, is gaining more recognition. And that's an important place to start for this kind of project, to say, we want to do something about this. We want to correct this legacy of infrastructure and Robert Moses. And it's a decade or decades type of project. From the design perspective, a couple things that come to mind is, first of all, how do we engage all of those stakeholders? Like you had mentioned, Professor K, reaching out to all of the NYCHA developments along the FDR. That's thousands of residents and tenants associations, and there's a lot of different views about the utility of the FDR. because the east side is deprived of public transportation, and especially in the East Village and Lower East Side, kind of far from the subway, people rely on the FDR to drive to their job in the Bronx or to Brooklyn or those sorts of things. And all of that, is going to come out, when you start to have this kind of conversation. So that's one challenge, is really listening to the stakeholder needs and perspectives at this sort of multi-neighborhood scale. I think another challenge is for the planners, in the city and in the design community to really think about systems and interrelationships between systems. In other cities that have undertaken highway removal projects, there has been this systems approach to transportation demand management. So I think, for example, in Seoul, Korea, with the Cheonggi-cheong Expressway, which was turned into this sort of linear park, when that highway was removed, there was a systematic increase in public transit within the city to absorb some of the demand that was being removed from the roadway. And I think it's that kind of systems thinking that's going to be important, again, because the East Side has less access to public transit. So how are we retooling those systems when we're considering, lowering the volume of traffic on the FDR?
Thank you. So Adam, before we go to you, I'm going to invoke my powers as an academic not subject to any governmental restrictions and throw a couple more things in there. So I'm still skeptical, understanding that our transportation planners generally agree whatever roadway we have, we'll fill it up. It doesn't, we could add more lanes, we could take away lanes, the effect to the individual is the same. And then on the flip side, I guess I'm just really sad not to see New York City thinking bigger, in the sense that it seems like, why not add more land if we really need the highway? Why couldn't we expand out fill in this area, understanding there's a lot of regulatory work to do with that, or alternatively, or in addition, talking about what Michael is talking about, there have been plans for a long time for increase of public transportation through ferry service, close, near and dear to my heart. Also, the Marine Highway, where freight has been discussed, pulling that off into the East River. What's the barrier to us doing something like on the scale that has been done on the West Side? When you look from the cruise terminal to Battery Park City, you're talking about billions and billions of dollars completely reshaping that. It's not just putting in a park. There was creation of land, taking away of land. I mean, most recently, Little Island, right? So why can't we get to that conversation rather than trying to shove this congested highway into the amount of space that we have? What prevents us from zooming out?
This is one of those questions that kind of explodes my head because there's so many things I want to say. But look, I mean, I think what you're really pointing to is our waterfronts are precious places, and they have to serve multiple needs. They have to, because the city has so many needs. Overlooked and vulnerable communities have so many needs. We are facing the existential threat of climate change, and we are a city of water. So what that really means, I think, is that when we think about any waterfront for any reason, we need to think about it on multiple levels and all of the services it performs. Open space is so important, but also building our bike network as an actual transportation system. And that goes a little bit, I think, to what Jessica was talking about and why community boards and public engagement is so important, because actually surfacing the different users that are going to be in these fairly compressed spaces and trying to meet all of their needs. I think absolutely resilience. We shouldn't ever be planning going forward for a waterfront park or a highway rehabilitation without thinking really long-term in terms of what the city's coastline is going to look like in 2100 and the massive challenges that we face. And we have to think about how we reshape the edges. The image behind me is of a rendering of the Financial District and Seaport Climate Master Plan, which is a plan that we released last December. We're very proud of, part of the larger Lower Manhattan Coastal Resilience family of initiatives to protect Lower Manhattan. I'd encourage everybody to go take a look. I will put the link in the chat. It is an ongoing process. It's, I think, a really innovative sort of plan to create a 2-level esplanade, extend the shoreline, to really provide both long-term flood protection as well as kind of a transformed waterfront with maritime infrastructure, with greenways, with piers, and doing all of it in kind of a smart way, and also using it as an opportunity to think about the future of the FDR viaduct there, which we actually looked at and found that there actually is really a really interesting opportunity, and heard a lot of both community and citywide stakeholders saying that the city should really think about taking that viaduct down. And, you know, I think we also have to be opportunistic. You know, the FDR, particularly the viaduct portions, are many of them nearing or at the end of their useful life. They have cracks and, you know, they're degrading and they need to be replaced. Those are incredibly important moments, I think, for communities, for planners, anyone who cares about New York City, to advocate for being ambitious and rethinking those. And really looking at opportunities to both maybe take the viaducts down, but also kind of reshape those to be complete streets, thinking about whether the same level of capacity is actually needed once we have congestion pricing. And lastly, to your question, Matt, I would say, like, it's important to know, if your students take one thing away, it's that when it comes to building in the water anywhere, the city doesn't decide that. There are state and federal agencies, principally State Department of Environmental Conservation and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They are the deciders, and their mandate, their legal mandate, is to have as little construction in the water as possible, based on really environmental laws that go back to the early 70s that are incredibly important, but did not anticipate climate change, or really the environmental justice movement in a lot of ways. So we really need to think, I think, about legislative solutions at those levels so that we have strong environmental laws that also allow us to really meet the challenge that we face, and kind of have you know, a modern 21st century idea of what the waterfront should be.
This is a very impressive answer. Thank you for navigating a controversial set of questions. I see Jessica. Do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I was just going to add, you know, something that really brought us to this point as a community board was the East Harlem resiliency study that Michael and his team did for our neighborhood following Hurricane Sandy, and a lot of that information, you know, highlighted the risk and the depth of the problem, and what, you know, the scale of the solution would need to be. And, you know, the process was a little bit convoluted on our side, but we had asked for that report from the city and went through the process of foiling it in order to understand what our risks are as a community. And that was something that was heavily redacted when it was handed to us, and sort of instigated the conversations that Starr Whitehouse and our community board have been having around what is East Harlem's risk when it comes to resiliency. But I think, you know, the city, you know, it's a lot of work that they would need to do, billions of dollars of investment into a community that is largely, you know, lower income, a lot of public housing. You know, we don't have the public-private partnership abilities that, you know, Lower Manhattan has, and there's a lot of challenges that come with that, and it's easy for us to be forgotten in that way, or to think that it's, you know, not as much of a importance. But I think when we look at the highway and think about it through an equity lens, we have to also think about all the other elements that the built environment has that impacts residents' health, and you know, from tree coverage, heat, violence, resiliency, sanitation use, saturation, all of the trash collection issues and the air quality issues, and even affordable housing. Like, all of these things impact your longevity, like how long you live on this earth. And we want East Harlem residents to be able to enjoy equal park spaces, and, you know, have the opportunities and the lifetimes expected in other neighboring districts. And we've also been asking for ferries for a long time, but there's, some sort of reason that we can't have it based on, what Adam's saying and the complexities of the waterways. So we've tried.
We'll sideline on that conversation when we're not being recorded. But a lot of really great points. I just want to pick out a couple things that people might not have understood in what you just said. A FOIL request is a Freedom of Information Law request. Public documents, most public documents, decisions, and plans like that resiliency plan are subject to public disclosure. And you as a citizen can write an email to the government demanding that those documents be released. There are complexities to whether or not that leads to it being released, including the government is able to say that there are certain things that cannot be released for various reasons, either protecting sensitive information or protecting trade secrets of organizations, or because things have not been decided yet. And then they could cross out those parts. What Jessica said is redacted. So you can get a document back. It's just black lines with maybe a word or two on it. And she had said when they did do that Freedom of Information Law request, the FOIL request, they received something back that was heavily redacted and they couldn't necessarily read it. So we won't go into the complexities of that. I just wanted to make sure you understood what she was saying. I really appreciate those outcomes. I will contest the fact that one area of the city should be better able or more enabled to do public-private than another. I'll demand more creativity from our appointed, elected, and hired officials. We've seen that across the country, and certainly in New York City as one of the places that really has figured out, at least some of the time, how to make those things work. And let's dig into some of those issues. Jerrod, I'm going to put this back on you and bring us back to Harlem River, and a question from Victor in the audience. Are you expecting residential values to increase around the pedestrian park and walkway? Creating local jobs is a good way to avoid locals from being priced out of rents. Are there other ways? And this was piled on by Richard Green, who said, I was involved as a consultant on West Harlem's Take Me to the River project. It had similar barriers, but also had railroad and bluffs to river access. A major community concern was how rent and lease economics would change, potentially becoming prohibitive to residents. How is this concern being addressed in your community outreach? So we all, in the public side, when we put in public amenities like a park, we do know that residential values increase. Generally, they increase in 3 phases. One, when it's announced that something might happen. One, when a plan actually is in place and funded. And one, when we see that actually construction is happening and it's really going to happen. Those are generally the 3 biggest bumps. This case, we would expect to see residential values go up. We're in 2 out of 3 of those phases that we said. And I guess the question is, what are ways that we could defend those residents from being displaced? One of the ways is to increase their income through local hiring, getting them some of those jobs. Jerrod, what are your thoughts on that affordability and avoiding displacement due to residential rises in value?
So this is a very heavy topic, and I'll try to answer it as succinct as possible. But a little bit of context, East Harlem has one of the highest concentrations of public housing in America. And historically, it's been a massive concentration of individuals with lower income or no income by design. So with the context in mind, how can we improve the quality of life for individuals that were blocked out in many cases for generations at this point, right? You now have had parents, grandparents, and children that have lived in the same economic situation. And, how can we as designers today kind of unlock that? I think there's a number of ways we should do it. I personally believe it starts with education. We should be providing better education opportunities so that, individuals can go and get a job and, and go and do these wonderful jobs that all of us get to enjoy, which will improve their quality of life, right? And this is one thing that we didn't really get right over the last 30 years. We should encourage them to improve the community that they live in. And we should facilitate that opportunity. So one of the problems we have right now, the last borough president of the Bronx actually told me this, that his son had to move to another borough because in the Bronx, there actually aren't creating a lot of housing for college educated young people, right? To come back, to reinvest, to stay in the neighborhood and to lift up the neighborhood that they grew in. You know, the city doesn't really have any programs or didn't have any programs to facilitate that. So I think that we should come up with a way to facilitate that, that yes, historically, things were not great here. We're going to improve that and help facilitate ways to have it here. You know, I think the Mitchell-Lama program was a pretty good program in New York that provided housing for middle class, you know, / lower income New Yorkers, that provided great shelter, great housing. We had a home ownership program that was a co-op program that provided equity in home ownership. In particular, this neighborhood, I told you I was trying to make this short. In this particular neighborhood, a friend of mine, Malik Yoba, who's an actor, his family got home ownership in East Harlem, not too far from the water, right? They got equity. And he said he saw directly the individuals who lived in public housing across the street and the individuals that lived in his affordable co-op building and the different trajectory in their life. Obviously, Malik went on to be an actor and director, but because his family had equity, you know, they were able to provide him with a slightly better life. And that kind of full scale in East Harlem, we need to think about how can we help provide a better quality of life for those in that community. Yes, in most major cities in America, the cost of living is gonna go up, right? That's been the case for the last, whatever, you know, almost 100 years now. So like, that's probably gonna continue. How can we help them get in the game, right? We're in the financial capital of the world. How can we help young folks in East Harlem participate in the economic engine of the planet? I think that it's possible. I think we just have to put a thoughtful effort into facilitating that. So I'm sorry, Matt, I tried to make that as short as possible. But in East Harlem in particular, I think the context is kind of important, that housing is expensive in Manhattan. Like, that's not going to change. Housing in East Harlem is going to be impacted by that. How can we help them, right, instead of hinder them in the evolution of the city? You know, we want the city to improve. We want parks to improve. That's a good thing. Usually the cost of living goes up in those scenarios. How can we help them so that they can be a part of that positive change and help them enjoy the improvement that's happening in their communities?
Jerrod, so happy you're here, and I don't think that answer was too long at all. I think it was a perfect length. We dropped a couple of links in there about Mitchell-Lama and affordable co-ops in New York, the HDFC program. Also, Adam dropped in the FIDI Seaport Climate Resilience Master Plan that he discussed recently, and we have another question there. I think that this just evidences how complicated a subject we're talking about. And here at the Urban Lab in NYU, we really believe we need more spaces like this, where we are bringing people together to actually get to the bottom of how we can talk about this. I'm going to do one more question, and then I'm going to broaden this out for our panel to the bigger question about how we are organized right now and why we're getting the outcomes that we're getting. Obviously, you receive what you measure to receive, or we are have to measure in order to manage, is another way Peter Drucker said it. And if we're focused on individual projects, what we get is individual outcomes. As we start zooming out, we could see something different. So I'm anxious to get to that and return to what some of Jerrod was talking about. But before we do that, let's just take one more swing back to Michael and just ask, on this particular project, the Harlem River Greenway link, where are we at in the process of design, construction, budget, schedule? What does it look like? And if there was a side question about whether there were value capture instruments in place on this project. I heard from this last discussion that the answer was no, but if there's something to add in that, feel free to drop it in.
Okay, thank you. Well, the design is complete, and the project will go out to bid next year. This is managed through EDC's Capital Group. Typically, bidding takes about a year, though I think everybody's moving as fast as they can to get it done, to start construction. Construction takes 2 to 3 years. it's important to recognize that this is part of an infrastructure project. So before the park is constructed, the whole waterfront platform and bulkhead has to be reconstructed as well. So that's what we're looking at. And I think everyone is moving as quickly as they can to get it open. I did want to kind of pick up on some things that the last question made me think about, which I think gets, it kind of starts to open up the topic of like who's responsible for some of the things that we're talking about, and especially a project like the FDR. So as a designer, we're asked, how a lot of these questions, how can you advance equity? What can you do about rising home costs around a public space project? And, what we can do is, we can design spaces for health and recreation. In the Greenway project, we've designed specific spaces with cultural programming in mind, and also spaces with education in mind, creating features in the park that educators in the neighborhood can bring students to engage with the waterfront and the ecology. So there's these kind of spatial solutions that can get embedded in the project. But then in terms of, jobs and housing, those solutions are more a part of the bigger systems that we as designers, are working within. I think a model to consider and look at are parks conservancies and parks management groups. So for example, Hudson River Park on the west side is a trust, it's a state entity. Central Park has a conservancy, which raises its own money for parks maintenance, for programming, and all of the amazing things that happen in Central Park. But of course, in a lot of instances where you have successful conservancies or trusts, they're linked to wealth. I think there are models that are emerging where parks management groups are starting to take on some of these more systemic issues of equity. So like the Franklin Park Coalition in Boston and Dorchester is doing a lot of work around parks access and cultural programming. And then also the planning around the 11th Street Bridge in DC and Anacostia, they developed an equitable development framework and a nonprofit entity to implement it. And that framework is addressing directly some of these issues about housing, job creation, and employment within the parks. So I think long-term, when you think about the FDR and all of the opportunities that it's going to open up, that's one of the governance questions that will have to be looked at very deeply.
Thank you. This panel couldn't have gone more in the direction that we were hoping to explore. So let's talk about all those questions that you raised, Michael. Lots of good questions. And this is a question for all of you. This is where we'll end the panel with this question. It might take us a few minutes. The question is, what kind of lessons for the FDR can we learn from some of these other structures that we've implemented in New York and elsewhere? And in particular, when we talk about structures, we're talking about governance. A question of governance is a question about financing. It's also a question about things like value capture, a question about who gets access to make decisions and whether things are parceled out or looked at as a whole. It's also a question about long-term management. So some of the longer-term projects that we've seen here, when we think about the Hudson River Park Trust, some of you may or may not know what Michael was talking about. That was ultimately created as a partnership between the city and state that is controversial to this day, but does involve capital and operating contributions from the city and state and from those capital programs, as well as third-party citizens donating to them. That's very similar to what's going on with Central Park, although we see different forms of that with other structures like the Governor's Island Trust, with Brooklyn Navy Yard Development Corporation, with the EDC itself, and also with things like the 42nd Street Battery Park City Authority, and many, many others just here in New York City. So Hudson River Park Trust was not something that was in the minds of people to start. By people, I mean the general government, but actually that was the result of a lot of activism by many individuals, including Tom Fox, who will be featured in one of our panels in a couple more panels from now, and asking some advice about how to raise it to that level. But the idea of looking at that entire span and supporting it from city and state and some federal dollars is really an interesting one when we think about the FDR. Obviously, that's not what's happening now, but what structures do you panelists think, with all of that background and all of that professor talk I just threw at you, what structures do you think might be useful for looking at this and for organizing as we move forward? What examples would you point at? What things do you think we should look at here?
So I'll just kick off because I think this relates to a friend and mentor of mine from Yale who recently passed away, Alex Garvin, the planner in New York City. His sort of, overarching comment was that urban planning should be done through public action that will produce a sustained and widespread private market reaction. So I think that's, in my opinion, it starts with city investment. But I loved what Michael was talking about in terms of the conservancy, and that's something I've actually been in conversation with, all of the groups that have been involved at the waterfront since the beginning, since before I was in East Harlem or on the community board. And there's just so much sense of ownership and pride and the amount of time and energy and commitment that these organizations have had. So there's a group called Friends of the East River Esplanade, another one called East River Crew, for example, and a woman with Green and Blue Eco Care, and they take great care of the waterfront and provide programming. And I think that nothing should happen without those sort of baseline community-based organizations that have already been there and have been supporting the community for decades. So I think it should be in partnership with the community board. I think, and I just worry, what we have community action groups in some positions to sort of help manage these sort of long-term, large-scale projects. And sometimes it's not always the best experience, and it can feel like tokenism, like you're, brought to a meeting to discuss something that, your opinion isn't really going to be, as a group, the group's opinion isn't going to be taken into account, or, so it needs to be something that's built with the history and the depth of the culture and everything that's been going on. But, it gives space for people to get involved over time, in my opinion.
I can go.
Thoughts, Jerrod?
I think we have other examples of parks that do very well in New York City. So I think we have a good variety of options, from Brooklyn to Queens to Lower Manhattan. We have a number of waterfronts that we can use as examples. I think, just kind of thinking into the future, we could create new vehicles too. Maybe we could do some crowdfunding that gets young people excited, right? And gets folks that are in the community, engaged in what's going on in that community. Having design charrettes, which I saw one of those that Michael had there, like continuing to have those on an ongoing basis that gets them involved in the evolution of their community. I think that's a structure kind of going forward, instead of, some smart people figuring out some things in an office room that nobody ever knows, that lays out a plan that like everybody's like all frantic about. I think a more engaging process going forward, I think is the better way to go. And I think one thing, and I don't know if we mentioned this yet, the waterfront on the Bronx side is getting redeveloped too. So I think there's going to be a neat little complementary kind of situation where there's going to be this, improved waterfront on the Manhattan side and an improved waterfront on the Bronx side. And I think for both of those communities, there's going to be a great improvement in quality of life. So that's fine.
Yeah, just picking up. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to turn it over to you. So great minds think alike.
There we go. Yeah, Jerrod, I'm glad you mentioned the Bronx Harlem River waterfront, which is a place where EDC has also been quite active. There's a project called Bronx Point, which you can see now at the first phase is almost complete, which is a project with hundreds of units of affordable housing. It's 100% affordable. A waterfront open space. We're also building a separate waterfront park next door, and the city's first universal hip hop museum is going to be part of that as well. So I think that project really points to the need to make holistic investments in communities, and to the question earlier about rising property values and the potential for gentrification and displacement. It's a big part of why we need to be making really aggressive investments in affordable housing and also all levels of housing. Everywhere that we are making these kinds of open space waterfront investments. I would just say a couple things about sort of like governance. I think it has to span the whole spectrum. So one level is just, as Jessica and Jerrod were alluding, every community has its experts, has its tradition of activism, particularly communities that have been at the brunt of very intentional decisions like Robert Moses to marginalize them. And you know, I think about, you mentioned Jessica, Mr. Toussaint, in Inwood, there's a community activist named Jim Cataldi, the Birdman of Inwood, who for many years sort of created a informal bird sanctuary and kind of wildlife refuge at the North Cove on the Harlem River, which is a place where we're going to be finally formalizing that into a kind of ecologically oriented waterfront open space that I hope will be named after him one day. He sadly passed away a couple of years ago. So whether it's Rocking the Boat in Hunts Point, or whether it's the Birdman in Inwood, or all of these, you know, activists and organizations across the city, they need to be really having a front seat at the table. I think then you need really coordinated coalition building. In Lower Manhattan, we helped create something called the Climate Coalition of Lower Manhattan, which is really a group that brings together local folks, Community Board One, the Seaport Museum, Smith Houses, a big NYCHA complex that is near that waterfront, but also citywide organizations like RPA and the Downtown Alliance, climate scientists and experts, environmental groups, all together, not just talking to the city, but talking to each other about how to make investments that benefit Lower Manhattan's community, but also the critical need to respond to climate change, and then building that into a political coalition that can really generate these investments. And then lastly, I'd say, I think when we really reimagine these waterfronts, we need to think about governance, special purpose entities, or public benefit corporations. There are many examples from the past. Matt mentioned many of them, but I think these projects are so complex, long-term, and multi-layered. They really need specialized kind of focus and consistent sort of attention across administrations and political cycles. And I think that's the kind of tool that is really needed.
Fantastic. Well, this has been a really great conversation. We could go on for months, and guess what? We're going to. Our next panel is just in a couple of weeks. If you attended this one, you should get an email from us for the next one. If not, I'm just going to put my email again in the chat. Feel free to reach out to me. We'll add you to our list. We're building just a wide list of people interested in this topic. We'll be doing another panel in early November, and then one in late November, early December. We'll take a little break for December, January. We'll probably do one or two more, and then go into what's called an advisory panel with the Urban Land Institute, where we'll be bringing in experts both locally and from elsewhere to look through all of this work and generate some reports. We particularly will be focused on issues of equity, sustainability, value capture, and governance, and just trying to create more information for people to select from as they go through this very complicated project. So thank you, Adam. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Jerrod. Thanks also to Natalie from NYU, who helped organize this. Thanks to the students in the Urban Lab that have been working on this, Daniela, Stokala, Leah, and Sanjana, three of whom are here. Really appreciate your work. This could not have happened without you. And this recording will be available on the Urban Lab website after we check to make sure we don't have to redact anything. And we will have all of our materials up there. So please do feel free to check back in there. We'll send an announcement when materials are up to that same list that we just described. So have a great day, everybody. Thanks for spending your lunchtime with us. And thanks again to the panelists for loaning us your expertise.